Good morning. Welcome to our presentation, Tongue-Tied by Authorities, Library of Congress Vocabularies, and the Shakespeare Authorship Question. I'm Michael Dudley.
I'm Bill Boyle.
And along with Catherine Hatinguais, who was not able to join us, we wrote a peer-reviewed article on proposing reforms to Library of Congress subject headings concerning Shakespeare. Just about us quickly first.
Hi, I've had a 35-year career in library land and a 40-year plus and counting career in Oxfordian studies and the movement. I've created websites, written papers, presented papers. More recently, I founded the New England Shakespeare Oxford Library, and inside the library, the Shakespeare Online Authorship Resources Catalog Database.
And I'm a university librarian and have been in public and academic libraries for about 30 years. Also been an Oxfordian for about 30 years and have written a number of articles for the Oxfordian and Brief Chronicles. Catherine worked as a translator for the UN and is now an independent researcher and volunteer with NISOL and SOAR. And all three of us are on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Data Preservation Committee, which is dedicated to preserving the history of the Oxfordian movement, preserving the research papers and notes of deceased Oxfordian researchers, and the digital preservation of authorship-related websites. The article is about to be published. It may already be published by the time this broadcasts, in the Journal of Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. It's a major library science publication, and since 1980 has been the only academic journal devoted to library cataloging. Despite its name, it actually appears 8 times a year and averages about 97,000 annual downloads or views. So we expect the citation is going to look something like this, but we don't have the exact citation yet, but we will certainly share it when it's published.
We should begin with a brief history of SOAR, Shakespeare Online Authorship Resources. SOAR was founded in 2008 by myself, William Boyle, as a project inside the New England Shakespeare Oxford Library book catalog. Its purpose was to provide access to all Oxfordian journal and newsletter articles in addition to books. From 2009 to 2017, our main activity was building the catalog itself, and we went from 500 records in 2009 to more than 8,400 in 2022, as we worked with Jim Warren and his index to Oxfordian publications. All the records in SOAR include the author's name, name of the article, publication title in which an article was published, and the year of publication. In addition, each record contains a link to a digital version of the article whenever possible, or to a fillable request form in order to request it from NISOL, where we own hard copy of everything that is listed in SOAR. Subject access was coming largely from keywords in the titles, plus broad categories such as reviews, conference news, obituaries, etc., that were in the records, plus an informal subject tagging system with broad categories such as play titles like Hamlet, the Sonnets, Italy, chronology, sources, etc. When Catherine Hatinguais joined with Boyle to work on the SOAR records, it was decided that the main need was to have enhanced subject access to all the records in SOAR. And that since we were already in a catalog using Library of Congress subject headings, using and adapting these headings would probably be the best way to proceed. So beginning in 2017, we embarked on a project to enhance all the SOAR records with detailed subject access, plus also excerpts from articles and abstracts. We used Library of Congress subject headings for complicated personal names and place names, and that was useful and saved a lot of time. However, we quickly realized that we could not live with the traditional Shakespeare, William, 1564 to 1616 subject heading and a catalog of authorship materials that was based on rejecting the Stratfordian attribution of the authorship. We would have to develop some alternative approaches, and as you'll see in the rest of this presentation, that is what we did, and that's what this presentation is about.
Before we examine our proposals, let's first have a look at some library science theory. Library of Congress name, authority files, and subject headings are what is referred to as controlled vocabulary. It's very important in library indexing that complex ideas, concepts, events that could in everyday conversation be described in a number of ways be assigned headings that there's only 1, 2, or 3 possible ways of accessing it in order to provide more accurate search results. For example, the Second World War can be described, as is the case with this book title, as Second World War all spelled out, but it could also be World War II with Arabic or Roman numerals. So the Library of Congress has settled on World War 1939 to 1945, a heading you would never actually use in everyday conversation, but the headings are formal and hierarchical. The other important thing is that they are based on what's called literary warrant. So a book or books actually have to be published on a given topic before the Library of Congress will give a heading to describe them. So in the case of the authorship question, the heading is Shakespeare William, 1564 to 1616, authorship. Obviously, if there was no authorship debate, the Library of Congress would never have come up with this heading if no books had been written on it. But with literary warrant, then, there is this expectation that the heading that is used is going to accurately account for the contents. So in library science theory, there are a number of concepts that are important to keep in mind. One is that the headings were first created in the 1890s and they have evolved since. So they are capable of capturing the state of knowledge in discourses. And they should hopefully, evolve as those discourses evolve. There's also the idea of aboutness, that between whatever most important heading and then others that can be added, and sometimes you'll find a dozen subject headings assigned to a book, that they capture the aboutness of that book, the subject, the argument, the theme, the discipline. And an important consideration here is not just that it's an abstract heading, a concept, but that it is going to be meaningful for people. And that's what social epistemology is about, is that different communities of knowers are going to have a different sense of the meaning behind a heading. The name William Shakespeare obviously has very different meanings for Stratfordians than is the case for Oxfordians. There's a completely different person that is imagined. And so ideally, library cataloging should account for diverse communities of knowers, that the heading should be meaningful to a lot of different users. And then finally, there's the matter of ethics, that regardless of how a library cataloger feels about a book or a topic, they may disagree with it completely, but they are obligated, because they have an ethical commitment to respect the autonomy and the judgment of users, to assign a heading that is actually going to be meaningful and usable. There are additional theories in the humanities and in philosophy that are also important: pragmatism, philosophical realism, and what French philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as the author function. First, pragmatism. Library indexing should be practical, usable, have real effects in the real world, and not just be abstract. So they should be user-oriented and meet the needs of communities of knowers. They should support the work of particular traditions or views and respect and reflect those specific discourses or domains rather than reflecting some presumed universal truth. Philosophical realism is the idea that we accept the existence of a mind-independent reality that is out there, independent of how we think about it, and it's one to which we can gain better access, as opposed to idealism, so the belief that there's no distinction between our beliefs and our senses of the world and the world itself, or radical skepticism, which says that we can't know anything beyond our own consciousness. So with the view of philosophical realism, we don't conflate beliefs about reality with reality. So we can believe that Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare, but the demands of philosophical realism are that you need to support that claim with evidence. And so for cataloging purposes, the knowledge claims in authority records require appropriate documentation. This brings us to the author function. Michel Foucault wrote that authorial names don't just denote individuals, but refer to a corpus of work. An author's name, he wrote, quote, performs a certain role with regard to narrative discourse, assuring a classificatory function. Such a name permits one to group together a certain number of texts, define them, differentiate them from, and contrast them to others. And so we argue that the name William Shakspere holds no author function, and that this needs to be recognized in library cataloging.
In the next part of our presentation, we're going to take a brief look at the history of the name battle, especially in the 19th century, Shakespeare versus Shakespeare. An important part of the history of the Shakespeare Authorship Question is that the name of the man from Stratford was spelled either Shakespeare or Shakespeare from the late 18th century right into the early 20th century on a significant number of publications about him and or his works. An interesting story about this is preserved in a biography published in 1851 by Charles Knight, one of the many 19th century scholars who always used the name Shakespeare when writing about Shakespeare, just as biographers of Mark Twain always make clear they are writing about a man named Samuel Langhorne Clemens. In Appendix 3 to his William Shakespeare, a biography, Knight relates the story of how early Shakespeare scholars George Stevens and Edmund Malone, working with the surviving autographs, his signatures on his will, came to the conclusion that the correct legal name was Shakespeare, but with perhaps a single use of Shakespeare on the last page of the will, an A added to the second syllable. Knight writes, it was for a long time thought that in the first and second of these signatures, the poet had written his name Shakespeare, but in the third, Shakespeare. Stevens and Malone held, therefore, they had the authority in the handwriting of the poet for uniformly spelling his name Shakespeare. They rested this mode of spelling the name not upon the mode in which it was usually printed during the poet's life, and especially in the genuine editions of his own works, which mode was Shakespeare, but upon the signature to the last sheet of his will, which they fancied contained an A in the last syllable. So it was these early scholars digging into the question of the spelling of the name that launched the use of the name Shakespeare for the first half of the 19th century. And the other interesting thing to observe here is that this, in effect, meant they were taking the position that Shakespeare of Stratford was the one who was using the pen name Shakespeare, the publication mode of his name. Using Google Ngram data, which draws on all the instances in the whole body of text of scanned Google books, if we put in Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, we get this interesting graph which shows in red how Shakespeare was very used in the early 19th century, and then in green how Shakespeare by the end of the 19th century and since then became overwhelmingly the dominant way that everyone referred to the author, and the other two variants simply disappeared. In the second Google Ngram, compressed to 1850 to 1920, you get a closer look at how the transition occurred around the 1850s to the 1880s. While this was going on, another publisher of Shakespeare, John Bell, defied Stevens and Malone and stuck with the spelling Shakespeare without the A, not Shakespeare, but Shakespeare. And interestingly, wrote to his readers and defended his choice by saying that S-P-E-R-E is another way to say spear. So as he changed the spelling, he kept the meaning of spear, which also is interesting in terms of the emotional attachment everyone had to the name Shakespeare. Knight also made an interesting observation about the name Shakespeare, when he wrote about owning a signature. Honored be those who have thus shown a reference for the name of Shakespeare. Reverence the symbol of the highest literature in Shakespeare's autograph. This again is showing a great emotional attachment, in this case, to the truth of the man's name, which he saw as Shakespeare of Stratford. Meanwhile, also in the 1850s, famous scholar James Hollowell Phillips wrote forcefully against all this and in favor of using the name Shakespeare. In the Life of Shakespeare section of his 1853 The Works of William Shakespeare, he writes about using Shakespeare as the poet's name. The question is one of very small importance, a piece of affectation, so far dangerous inasmuch as it harmonizes not with the beautiful lines that have been consecrated to his memory by Ben Jonson and other eminent poets. In the very next paragraph, he continues this thought. The only method of reconciling these inconsistencies is to adopt the name as it is bequeathed to us by his contemporaries. And there is a great additional reason for doing so when we reflect on the certainty that the poet, who used his pen or shook his spear, as Bancroft has it in his epigrams, was called Shakespeare by his literary friends. A couple of years later, still in the 1850s, a major event occurs. Delia Bacon publishes her book, The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded, and in effect launches the authorship debate. And note that she uses the name Shakespeare. And just as a sidebar here, it's interesting to note in Wikipedia, when they discuss Bacon, they refer to the title of this book as The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded, which just shows you what is at stake with the spelling of the name. If we jump ahead another 20 years, we come back to James Hollowell Phillips again, writing a pamphlet in support of his view on the spelling of the name. The article says that Mr. Hollowell Phillips has printed for private distribution a small pamphlet which goes far to settle the vexed question of the spelling of Shakespeare's name. Mr. Furnival seemed to many people to stand on solid ground when he affirmed that the great dramatist surely knew how to spell his own name. His signature occurs 3 times in his will, and there it is spelled Shakespeare. What could be more conclusive? The very next sentence after this in the New York Times article is, happily for the interest of minute controversy, the form in which Shakespeare wrote his name on this occasion is not so conclusive as it seems. This really sums up the state of the debate on spelling, which is very much the emotional attachment to the name Shakespeare versus the fact that his name was Shakespeare. We jump ahead to Wikipedia in 2011, where there was a battle over this issue about the spelling of the name on the Shakespeare Authorship Question page. We see 2 more instances that continue the same thought. In the first section on Wikipedia, and we read, in his surviving signatures, William Shakspere did not spell his name as it appears on most Shakespeare title pages. Notice that he did not spell his name. Same thought. He didn't know his name was Shakespeare, and or he didn't know how to spell it. In the next section, we read, nearly all academics believe that the author referred to as Shakespeare was the same William Shakspere who was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564. Well, no, it was William Shakspere who was born in Stratford in 1564, and William Shakspere is how he signed his name. One further instance in writing about this, in 1994, Irv Mattis, in one of the many authorship books that started coming out in the new era of the authorship debate, had this to say about the spelling issue, which again echoes everything we've been looking at here. He writes that it appears that the author had adopted a stage name that would become his pen name as well, and that he was known as Shakespeare in the city and Shakespeare in the country. So this is just a brief overview of how this debate has gone over several centuries now. My concluding thoughts on this here are that the debate over the spelling of the name began in the 18th century and continues to this day. But, and this is a big but, the original debate was basically over being accurate and being true to the author's true name, and thus honoring his true name. A significant number, perhaps a majority, of writers and publishers used the Shack with no E after the K version of the name up until the middle of the 19th century. With the publication of Delia Bacon's book in 1857, the spelling debate took an abrupt turn. By the early 20th century, Shakespeare was how the author was referred to, and Shakespeare and Shakespeare vanished. It would thus appear that the specter of the authorship debate and the notion that the perfect sounding and meaningful name Shakespeare was indeed a nom de plume was a factor in this change. Let's take a look now at the history of Library of Congress vocabularies concerning Shakespeare. Back in the beginning of the 20th century, the early decades, the name Shakespeare became the standard heading used by Library of Congress, American Library Associations, etc. The American Library Association subject headings used the form Shakespeare, William, with no dates attached, as early as 1911. Shakespeare, William, 1564 to 1616 first appears in the preliminary list of literary subject headings, third edition in 1917, and in the subject headings used in the dictionary catalogs of the Library of Congress, second edition in 1919. It has remained unchanged since then. In all cases, the author is implicitly assumed to be William Shakspere of Stratford, whose name appears in the official name authority file for Shakespeare as a simple variant, i.e. Shakespeare William 1564 to 1616, appearing on a long list of other variants. There are many subdivisions under the Shakespeare main heading. The major ones fall into three categories. First, the biography of William Shakespeare, which means, of course, a biography of William Shakspere of Stratford, the birth, family, career, death, etc. of the man who was born and raised and died in Stratford. Second major category is literary criticism and interpretation of Shakespeare's works, covering characters, plots, sources, styles, allusions, etc., which of course transcends being about the Stratford man's own life and death in Stratford. The third major category is the derivative cultural productions: glossaries, periodicals, concordances, anniversaries, congresses, monuments, exhibits, theatrical productions, film adaptations, etc., which, of course, like literary criticism, is separate from the actual biography of the actual author. Another interesting thing that evolved over the 20th century is the notion of careers. And for a period of time from 1980 to 1993, the entries for Shakespeare included numerous careers: editing career, espionage, journalistic, lecturing, medical, military, political, teaching, theatrical, translating, were all listed under biography. All these have now been subsumed under a more general biography subdivision. In hindsight, it appears this proliferation may have been due to the fact that the Shakespeare heading serves as a template to describe the lives and careers of other literary authors. But it came and went over a period of about 15 years. Authorship is a main heading and as a subdivision. Authorship itself can be a main heading covering anything, including classes of writers, literary forms or genres, writing techniques, etc. Later, in 1975, authorship was clarified to the subdivision was clarified that it could be used as a subdivision under the individual names of authors or works in cases of dubious or disputed authorship. Another interesting evolution from the beginning of the 20th century to the late 20th century. In the case of Shakespeare, the subdivision authorship is associated with the second level subdivision Baconian theory and collaboration. And then later in the century, 1948, the Oxford theory was introduced, the Darby theory in 1957, others of the Burton theory, the Marlowe theory, the Rutland theory. Most recently now, there's undoubtedly been established the North theory. But the construction, Shakespeare William 1564 to 1616 authorship theory, whereby the authorship question is always nested under the entry for only one of the possible candidates, i.e., Shakespeare of Stratford. This is highly problematic and logically untenable, but it does serve the purpose of burying the authorship issue and treating any questioning of the authorship of the Stratford man buried under several layers of certainty that he is the author. There are other headings or subdivisions of possible relevance to the Shakespeare authorship question throughout the Library of Congress list of subject headings. And just looking at the numbers, the number of hits next to all these in itself indicates, in my view, how much authorship is questioned and how many examples there are of disputed authorship, spurious and doubtful works, anonyms and pseudonyms, and outright literary forgeries and mystifications. In all these cases, as you can see, there is a great deal of authorship dispute and questioning, frauds and hoaxes and questions. In the case of Shakespeare, though, all of this becomes buried underneath the Stratford man, the main entry for Shakespeare, William, which is then actually substituting for the real name of the man from Stratford, Shakespeare, William. So this, again, is part of the larger problem we have encountered, how current Library of Congress cataloging practice and name authority record keeping keeps the authorship issue simply buried.
Let's now examine a sample of authorship-related books and the subject headings that they've been assigned to get an idea of how inadequate the current Library of Congress authorities are. First is Loney's Shakespeare Identified, which, as you can see, is given the primary subject heading of Shakespeare William 1564 to 1616 authorship, and then a heading for Oxford, and then a heading again for Shakespeare authorship and Oxford theory. With the 1564-1616 dates, the Library of Congress, of course, is saying that the main subject of this book is the author William Shakespeare, who had those dates. But, of course, that's not what Loney's book is about, and he's arguing against that very thing. With Ramon Jimenez's Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, with the subject heading again with these birth and death dates, this is not an accurate depiction. This is not capturing the aboutness of this book, because Shakespeare's Apprenticeship is about the early writings of Edward de Vere. It's entirely about Edward de Vere as Shakespeare, and so these headings do not accurately capture that. The same thing goes for Richard Paul Rowe's The Shakespeare Guide to Italy, in which he argued that the geographic details and architectural details were so accurate that the author, whomever he was, must have gone to Italy, and because Shakespeare of Stratford never traveled out of England, we know it couldn't have been him. And so these subject headings, again, are not an accurate reflection of the contents or the intention of the author. The same problem here for Hank Whittemore's The Monument. It's not about Shakespeare of Stratford in any way. It is about Edward de Vere and the Earl of Southampton. So the subject heading doesn't make sense. With Contested Will, it does reflect Shapiro's argument that Shakespeare of Stratford was Shakespeare, but all things being equal, Shakespeare should be treated as just one of the potential candidates, along with Oxford and Bacon. So what changes are we proposing to the Library of Congress authorities that might be able to address these concerns? One is that we would establish a new authority heading Shakespeare William 1564 to 1616 and remove the current heading Shakespeare William. Instead, step 2 is that we would have a heading Shakespeare William with no dates. And then these two authority records would be linked, so regardless of how one searches, you would find the books indexed with both, or in the case of works that do not talk about Shakespeare, having the heading Shakespeare William. The authority record for Shakespeare William would, like this record for Martin Marprelate, indicate in a special note that it is likely a pseudonym. And the same thing here for the authority record for Alan Smithy, which is used in the film industry for directors who wish to remove their name from a film. The fourth change is that we would establish a major new top-level heading, Shakespeare Authorship Question. So all discussion of the authorship debate itself, as well as headings relating to the alternative proposed candidates, would appear under this heading. It would allow the authorship question to be treated as a legitimate form of inquiry unto itself. So the rationale here is that Shakespeare William 1564 to 1616 is used for works that do talk about the Stratford man. So Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography by Diana Price would have the Shakespeare William heading. But a book like Shakespeare by Another Name by Mark Anderson would be just Shakespeare William, because it doesn't relate to the Stratford man. And then Shakespeare Authorship Question, again, allows us to index a book like Contested Will, because it's all about the authorship question.
Now that you've seen the proposed changes, let us look at the same 5 books again to see what happens when we change the subject headings. First one, Shakespeare Identified. As we saw, the problem there was with having the entry William Shakespeare and the birth dates of the man from Stratford, the entry contradicts the subject matter of the book. When the entry is changed to Shakespeare William with the 1564 to 1616 birth dates, that accurately reflects he's being discussed as an individual, as Edward de Vere is being discussed as an individual, and Shakespeare William is being discussed as the author of the works, whoever that might be. And finally, the Shakespeare Authorship Question, the new heading we are proposing, then covers what is really the main topic of the book, which is the Shakespeare Authorship Question. If we go to Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, we see again the same problem, that the book is about juvenilia written in the 1580s, probably by Oxford, at a time when the man from Stratford could not possibly have been involved. And yet the subject heading has him and his birth dates, and again, him and his birth dates and criticism and interpretation of his works when he couldn't have been writing the 1580s. Proposed changes, again, both use the Shakespeare William pseudonym entry, and then Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, as the other person discussed in the book. The Shakespeare Guide to Italy, same problem. The man from Stratford did not leave England, so could not have been the one traveling in Italy, and could not have been the one who possibly wrote the works with demonstrating his knowledge of Italy. With the new headings, we simply have, again, Shakespeare William, knowledge, Shakespeare William, travel, Italy. Hank Whittimore's The Monument. He does not discuss the man from Stratford at all, so his subject heading about the man from Stratford attached to this book is simply wrong. New headings, we have again Shakespeare William, the sonnets, we have Oxford and Southampton as the two major figures discussed in the book, and we have Shakespeare Authorship Question, our new heading, as the other, that the subject matter the book is actually about. And finally, James Shapiro's Contested Will, same problem again with the headings. And the solution is simply to have Shakespeare as one entry, Shakespeare William, Shakespeare Authorship Question, and since he primarily discusses the Oxfordian and Baconian theories, to also have entries for Oxford as a person and Francis Bacon as a person. It's pretty simple and straightforward. What about conventional biographies? Well, in all cases, they now are cataloged as Shakespeare William, with the traditional birth dates, and dramatist, English, etc., etc. The change here is quite straightforward. It's simply Shakespeare William, 1564 to 1616, followed by Shakespeare William, the heading for the pseudonymous author, whoever it may have been. Pretty simple and straightforward.
So for our conclusion, first, let's revisit our theoretical justifications from library science and philosophy. Philosophical realism, assuming skepticism towards knowledge claims unless there's actually evidence. And for library purposes, you can only describe what can be demonstrably proven. The authority records require documentation. These new headings reflect better the aboutness of authorship-related books. Pragmatism. These headings are more usable for researchers interested in the authorship question. Social epistemology. These headings better reflect the understandings and priorities of a more diverse range of communities of knowers and not just the Stratfordian perspective. These headings also better reflect the state of knowledge in the authorship discourse. The new headings also fulfill Foucault's ideas about the author function. More than the name of an individual, Shakespeare has to refer to a corpus of work, while Shakespeare does not. And finally, ethics, that these headings would better enable catalogers to fulfill their ethical responsibilities, to be able to describe the aboutness, to reflect social epistemology, to respect the autonomy and judgment of users, and to meet the information needs of multiple communities of knowers.
Hence, thou suborned informer, a true soul when most impeached stands least in thy control. As Michael and I were discussing this presentation and what to do and how to end it, it just sort of popped up. And we thought it would be a fit ending because this is what we are dealing with. Suborned informer seen as a history that lies to you is what De Vere stood against, even as he was the victim of that history. And what we are doing here is tackling the core issue of the authorship debate. What was the name of the author? And not just De Vere versus Shakespeare. As we know, it's about who was Shakespeare and was it Shakespeare or Shakespeare? And I, for one, we've had many interesting conversations, and in the course of a year, more than a year, working on this article, I have learned a few things after 40 years. And one of them, as you saw in our in the wrap-up we did, is that mainstream scholars for the bulk of the 19th century had a debate about the name, and it had nothing to do with the authorship. It was simply scholars debating the truth of the true name versus what we now think and almost all agree on is a pen name, Shake-Spear, a name with a meaning. And what had not occurred to us and now occurs to us, and I don't know how I missed it, and after 40 years of being an Oxfordian and 40 years of being a librarian, the Library of Congress is the gatekeeper on names. We have an agency with charged to an historical mission of preserving the truth about what a name is and what the history is. And what we've done in this paper and the research going into it, and now that it's being published, we hope the impact it will have, and I really do hope it has some impact, that we have a way to go at this issue that had not existed before. We can simply say, we need to establish the truth of the name. And once established is that all other arguments should fall by the wayside. And it doesn't matter whether you like the name Shakespeare or not. If his name was Shakespeare, it was Shakespeare. And if you want to say that he is the one who chose the name Shakespeare later, which as we saw in the 19th century, several scholars did, so be it. Then Shakespeare is a pen name and the man from Stratford chose it. And we can live with that because that blows up the existing paradigm of Shakespeare was born in Stratford and replaces it with the truth that Shakespeare was born in Stratford. And whatever happened in London was anyone choosing to be Shakespeare.
Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. We're sorry we can't be there in person to deliver this. Love to be able to engage in some dialogue about it. So please feel free to email us and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you.